Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
All right, everyone, welcome to today's ASRG webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about ASRG and get some of the legal stuff out of the way. ASRG is a nonprofit organization founded to support the development of the automotive security industry. We have developed a platform and a community to share knowledge, communicate through networks, and to build value with collaboration. This is a community for you, built by you, with the goal to protect our friends and family when using automotive products. If you want to learn more about ASRG or get more involved, please visit our website at www.asrg.io or send us an email at hello@asrg.io. Before we jump into the presentation today, let's get some of the legal stuff taken care of. The views and opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of those that have made them. They do not represent views or opinions of ASRG and are to be considered as informational. The use of this information is to be used by the individual and/or organization at their own risk.
Hello, and welcome to the CYRES Consulting Services presentation on the UN Regulation 156 and the Software Update Management System. My name is Tobias Pilz, and besides being an expert in information and cybersecurity, I'm also the expert here for the Software Update Management System, the UN R156, and a member of the DIN and ISO working group on the creation of the ISO 24089 for the Software Update Management System. So the Software Update Management System as a whole is a huge and interesting and pressing topic in the automotive industry, and therefore I want to talk about a bit of the requirements and everything that surrounds the Software Update Management System in order to give you an impression of what is important and what you need to know in the matter of implementing or just gaining general knowledge and awareness of the Software Update Management System. Here is a short agenda. So I will talk about the regulation, the standard, and a bit about the timeline so you can see when what is happening. Then I will talk about the SUMS in the organizational context, some SUMS activities, and also challenges, and give a short summary on the points that we have talked about. So in general, towards the Software Update Management System, there's a lot of questions which are being posed in the context, and also for us as consultants, there are these questions which then we should answer. So some examples are, how does the software update management and the regulation impact us as an OEM, as a supplier? How do I need to take care of these requirements? And what is the impact, for instance, as a business-related topic here? And so there's all kinds of, depending on where you're coming from, all kinds of questions which are have to be answered. And this is an excerpt of it. So with this presentation, we will answer some of these questions, but also then there needs to be further a deep dive for answering others. So in a matter of the regulation, the standard, and a timeline, I will point out some major differences between the regulation and the standard, and then show some major steps on the timeline for you to understand where the status of what the status of the standard is, and also how the regulation affects the automotive sector. So the UN R156 is a regulation, and being a regulation means that it's created by a government or by an entity giving really a legal framework which needs to be adhered to, in this case, the UNECE. So for the UNECE member states, this is really important to be compliant to the requirements towards the SUMS, because if you are not compliant, then this might lead to a sales ban of the vehicles in the entirety of the UNEC member countries. And then on the other hand, you have the standard, the ISO 24089, which is a state-of-the-art reference made by the industry, which of course covers then also and gives SUMS requirements, and which can help and support, for instance, in court as being compliant towards the software update management system. But what has also been added here is that these two documents, so to say, cover the same topics, but the requirements and so are not the same, meaning that you really have to see what do I need to be compliant against in order to really look at the requirements in details, because you will find sometimes nuances, but sometimes also different requirements that you should adhere to, depending on whether or not you're looking on the UN R156 or the ISO 24089. So, of course, in a bigger concept of cars and OEMs and manufacturers versus then, or in combination and working together with the suppliers, there's of course a impact of the regulation and then later on also of the standard for the ecosystem in the automotive sector. And with this, here we wanted to show a bit of a comparison also with the UN R155 and cybersecurity, which you might be more familiar with already. So here, for instance, it is said that the risk of the suppliers needs to be managed, while on the other hand, for the UN R156, in cases for suppliers, the suppliers should support the manufacturer with information and so on to really show that a software update is managed properly. So in comparison, it means a bit that here the supplier should be more focused on really showing that and giving evidence that they are compliant, while here it's more about information supply and supporting the OEM when you look at it for how it is described within the regulation. But of course, in reality, there's also a bit of a different dynamic, meaning that the OEM will forward and will give requirements towards managing and also executing, performing software updates towards the supplier, while on the other hand, the supplier then will adhere and must adhere to these requirements when it comes to software update management and software update provision and execution. And on top of that, then the technical service with the approval authority, they will look and in the end look at the processes, of course, and see if the management system is in place, but they will also then test the exemplary vehicle to see if the software updates and the requirements were properly integrated into the vehicle. And with this, I would like to move to the timeline. So the timeline is the point where we say we have the ISO and we have the UN R156, but there's a difference in when what was happening and when what was released. And it's really important to see, okay, there's a release of the ISO, which comes after the UNR is mandatory. So here I wanted to start with beginning of 2021, where the ISO was in a CD stage. So this was a rough documentation, but it was far away from documentation and completion and seeing where the requirements would end up. So, but then on March 2021, the UNR was already published, and this with this, everybody was off to the races when it came to being compliant to the requirements. And in addition, then there was the DIS, which means currently we are in the DIS from Q3 2021, meaning there is a draft version where currently comments are being looked at and then later the year, there will be the FDIS stage reached. So with already here July 2022, the requirements from the UN R156 will become mandatory. So here, this is already the first point in time where for new vehicle types, this really needs to be considered. And then here to see that the standard will and is planned to be released for end of 2022. So there's already a time difference between the release and then the requirements being mandatory. And here, and this is also a bit in comparison sometimes for the CSMS, so there might be, and this really needs to be defined and is still to be defined by entities, how and when to check for the completeness of the UNR requirements. So it can very well be that the same leeway that is in place for the CSMS might then be in place for the SUMS, but this is not decided on yet. So this will then be a future topic. And with the timeline, I would like to conclude this point and talk a bit about the organizational context, now coming from a bit more of the regulation and the standard. So here looking more into the points where it comes about what do I do with the SUMS in a matter of the organizational context that is that I'm trying to integrate it. So the organization that you're having is basically set up of some kind of governance which you're having and the management which you're having, meaning that these are already, let's say they're there, and you need to integrate management systems into your existing organization. You have also the product lifecycle, which then shows where you go with your products. And then for a CSMS perspective, this product lifecycle would then, the CSMS would cover the entirety of the product lifecycle. So with the SUMS, however, this is really focused, the requirements are really focused on the cars being in post-registration, meaning that here we're not talking about software updates for production or so, we're really talking about software updates for cars that are on the road, so to say. And with this, the CSMS and the SUMS, you might also find certain interfaces, connectivity points here, such as the risk management and the vulnerability management, which we will go into more detail in the next slide. And in addition to all that, there are also some technical requirements for the software update management system. And these are then aiming at the vehicle type. And for this, it has to be said that also, despite the fact that really it's aiming for post-registered cars, some technical aspects would already have to be considered in the development and the production phase of a vehicle, for instance, or a component. If you say, okay, I want to provide a software update, so I have technical requirements, providing enough resources for the process of the software update to finish, or for fallback scenarios, things like that. So this should already be considered earlier on in order to be prepared for this. There's also to say that also a hardware exchange with a new software would count as a software update and would also fall under the regulation, as it will also pretty surely fall under the requirements which will come out from the ISO standard. So this is really important to say, okay, I have this company, this organization set up, so what do I need to look at when it comes towards integrating management systems for cybersecurity, but especially here for SUMS. So towards these interfaces between CSMS and SUMS, let's start here with the risk management. So basically the risk management, there's more risks that need to be managed that are introduced by processes, people, and technologies for software updates, but also you can mitigate risks through software updates where you say, okay, I have something identified, how may I handle this risk? And then you say, oh, maybe we can roll out a software update. So this then goes hand in hand with vulnerability management. So you have new connectivities, for instance, in the vehicle for over-the-air updates. So this might introduce more vulnerabilities, but also with over-the-air updates, you can quickly fix vulnerabilities that you have discovered later on in the vehicle's lifecycle, or even the component's lifecycle. And last but not least, governance and culture are really important topics here. So for governance, you have new input factors. Your external governance influences your internal governance. And with this, you need new goals, new controls, etc., but also the culture. The culture is important for implementing cybersecurity, and it's also important for software update management, because you need to have everybody who is involved with the software and the updates to work together on an, let's say, end-to-end process to get a good and final result, and to thoroughly work on this. And for this, everybody has to be aware. Everybody has to have the certain knowledge from his or her perspective in this case to really work as a team and work in the management system very well. And also on top of this, you can see this from a different perspective, meaning you have the software updates and they will mainly happen in the post-production phase. So, and with this, you will also have and face requirements for the organization, requirements for projects, where you say, how do I run projects? What do I need to do in these projects to perform and execute software updates? And then also, how do I run campaigns on different targets, on different vehicle types, etc. So here is a short overview. So as mentioned, software updates can happen in different stages, but the focus is really on the later stages when the car is on the road. But the requirements remain very broad for all kinds of topics. And with this, I would like to conclude that chapter and talk a bit about SUMS activities, because out of the organization, there's really some things that you need to know when it comes to really executing the processes. So here in the next slides, we'll talk a bit about more hands-on requirements and more hands-on things that are necessary to know. With the keywords, here's really some keywords you should know if you talk about software update management. So first of all, there's the RX SWIN, which comes from the regulation. So it's basically the identifier, which as an example is the R83 RS WIN. No, sorry, the R83 SWIN. That is, for instance, the regulation for emission control. So with this identifier, you would identify the system for emissions, and then connected to this identifier, you would go into showing which software versions are related to this regulated entity, meaning this is my system, and I have these components and so on running this and that software on it, to really show that the system you're claiming and the software which is running, which is connected to the type-approved system, is really the one that is in the vehicle. In addition to that, you also have the identity, the integrity validation data, where you have to show that actually the software, let's say, remains unchanged, and you can see that the integrity of the software is really there. So these are the software versions, and the integrity validation data are the 2 points that are connected to the RX SWIN and are really need to be there. And then the third point is also to have a listing of the hardware that is also related towards the system identified by the RX SWIN. Then we have the vehicle user. Of course, the vehicle user driving the car, owning the car is also the major target as a person here. So he needs to receive information about software updates, but he also might or might not participate in a software update process. So he is really a huge factor. And on top of this, we also have the skilled person. So the skilled person is defined as a person that has the skills to finalize also software updates that require a certain skill or certain knowledge about the software update. So this can be the vehicle user, but it can also be a technician or somebody working in a workshop or somebody who is remotely in control of a over-the-air software update in order to calibrate a sensor or something like that, that then is really necessary to finalize the software update process. So you really have to make sure here that if this is required in a matter of the software update that you're running, that you have these people in place who see this through. Then we have the vehicle safety. Of course, safety is very important. So here also for software updates, especially for over-the-air software updates, but also for regular updates where you might change a function or affect a function, which has to do with safety. So safety always needs to be ensured in a matter of software updates. You also have the in-vehicle resources. So for instance, for over-the-air update, you need to make sure that if the software update is executed, you have enough power, you have enough memory, and so on, but that you might also have enough resources left to go into a fallback or a failure solution if the software update fails or if there's something happening while you're updating the software, and that, for instance, you can bring the car into a safe state or something similar. Then you also have OTA, over-the-air updates, which is already now, but then in the future becoming more and more relevant. And you have the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is here very important. First of all, because you have to have a lot of documentation to show that you're compliant to the regulation. So this documentation is existing somewhere and you have to protect it. So whatever infrastructure you're using for all this information and documentation, there are protection measures that should be in place. And then on the other hand, you have the infrastructure that's distributing your software updates. And of course, against manipulation and other factors, you really have to ensure that the software updates are protected on the infrastructure and that these systems are also safe and secure in that matter, so that the software updates cannot be tampered with. And last but not least, you have audit and assessment. So being able to take the documentation to document your execution of the software update and then package it so that for an assessment or an audit by the technical service or the approval authority or other related instances, you can provide the documentation for the software update management system and the execution of software updates. So these are very important topics, but also in the next step, I would like to quickly go through some of the regulations and the regulation and the requirements in the regulation, just to give you an overview of roughly where you can find something in the regulation. And it has to be said that this is publicly available. You can download it. So there's the version which basically just states the requirements, but there's also the interpretation which is available on the internet, from where you can even see more insight from what is meant by requirements or how and what factors you need for the fulfillment. So of course the regulation is made up of different kinds of chapters where you go through and have certain topics, but the main requirements are then here in chapter number 7. So as you can see here, it really starts with some basics, saying, for instance, that the information being relevant to the regulation is documented and securely held, meaning that you really have to take care of the security of your documentation. But it then also here covers points like the RxS win, where this is basically described what is necessary as an identifier. Then you also have here further processes and descriptions that need to be in place. For instance, here that the vehicle user is able to be informed about the updates, so that you really also give information and have him knowing of what's going on with the software updates. Then you also have a whole bunch of documentation requirements in the end, where there is all kinds of examples of what you need to record and what you need to be able to show in order to see you have a properly functioning software update management system. And then here at the bottom, you have some more security requirements. So for instance, that you protect your software updates, but also that you run verification and validation of software functionality and code, so that you really can prevent bugs and other things. So that is really important to say. You also need to do a whole lot of testing for software updates in order to fulfill these requirements. And then you also have certain requirements for over-the-air updates on a procedural side, so that you really have processes in place that cover not only updates through the wire or in a workshop, in a dealership, but also over the air as you just perform them wirelessly. And then here at the end, there's also requirements for the vehicle type, meaning these are the more technical requirements I was speaking of, where you see, okay, I have to have security on the car for the software update. I have to have still some kind of proof about the RxS win, the software versions, etc. So here's also cases where you have this identifier either on the vehicle or not held on the vehicle. And whatever case you're having for the components, the cars, and that you're covering this with, you either can go either way and say, okay, I want to handle it this way or that way. Here in addition, it should also be said that the RxS win as an identifier is not mandatory as a matter of really using this, let's say, numbering format. But what you should be prepared for is to be able to show that for a certain regulation and the system that is supposed to be covering that regulation, that the software versions and the integrity validation data is in place. So even if you don't use the RxS win as it is defined, you should be able to comprehensively show the connection between the regulation and the software running on it. And then here it's also important, for instance, to notice that with the application for approval, you need the certificate of compliance, meaning that before you even go for the vehicle type approval, you need to have the management system, the processes, the requirements covered in order to achieve the certificate of compliance, the COC. So this is a prerequisite for then the vehicle type approval, so that it is shown that these processes are working and in place. So, and with this, I would like to conclude the overview here and talk a bit more about the simplicity or on a simplistic level about the software update here as it is executed. So in this line, you have the pre-update phase where you say, okay, is everything prepared? Have I done my necessary steps? Have I covered requirements, everything I should be doing before I roll out and execute a software update? Is my infrastructure ready? And so on. So am I prepared? Then you have the execution of the software update. So the main focus is here over the air, as this is already a huge topic, but also becomes more and more popular. But the regulation, as well the standard, will cover both and all kinds of software updates. And then in the post-update phase, so to say, you have to finalize related documentation on was the software update successful, was the software update communicated correctly, and so on. So all these things, of course, there's documentation which you should have ahead of time in the pre-update phase, but then once you need to finalize and you have finalized the software update, you really need to show that everything is in place and document everything that is related to the executed software update. So the major goal is really here to bring from any kind of infrastructure the software update towards the car, especially necessary through a protected line, and then also in addition receive some feedback on the software update procedures, as it's always good and necessary to track how software updates are performing and to see, okay, is there any kind of failure management? What do I need to take care of? Because this will be important, for instance, if something fails and then the car needs to reach a safe state, and then you need to figure out how do I get the car out of the safe state, or what steps do I need to take to bring the car back on the road. In addition to that, I want to talk a bit about the compliance and the certification here in also a bit of a procedural format. So you have in general the whole bunch of requirements that you need to show. So you have to have information and documentation. For instance, if you have an affected vehicle type approved system, which a software update is changing and the parameters are changing, or for instance, your technicalities, your testing, your test results is changing, then you need to maybe get a and through this modification get something like a recertification, or get an extension of the type approval, meaning that if you have an RxS win and then you really update the vehicle type approved system, then you also need to update the RxS win. So these are really important steps on the matter of documentation and information that you're having in order to really show that you have the software update under control and it's managed thoroughly. Then you also have, of course, protect your software updates and provide failure and fallback scenarios, for instance, being prepared for this. So the other thing then is to go into the certification. So the technical service or the approval authority will audit the processes, of course, but then later on also for the vehicle type approval will audit the exemplary vehicle in order to show the vehicle type approval. And the emphasis is on over-the-air updates. And so this is really the focus point here on the technical service. And then you have the validity of the confirmation, so the COC for 3 years. And every 3 years, then there might be a recertification for that. Or it might even come earlier as you figure out, okay, I have a modification which is modifying my the certification. So I might have to renew the certification or get an extension of the certification, depending on if my parameters are changing. And then this extension would also have a validity of 3 years. So this showcases a bit of what is important to think of when you think more about the audit and the certificate of compliance and the vehicle type approval. So, and with this, I would like to go into the challenges in summary. So what are the challenges here? So the challenges lies, of course, first of all, with integrating the software update management system into the company, the organization, but also in existing management systems that you're having, meaning that you should start a top-down approach, defining policies, defining guidelines, where you say, okay, this is how I want my software update management system to run, and this is the framework of how it is running. Then you have, of course, culture and processes to take care of, so really make everybody involved aware that this is an important topic and that this really needs to be run through thoroughly, and establish the processes for it so they can be defined and gone through smoothly, so that you have the software update management system in place. Then also for technical requirements, but also for the entire product life cycle, you need to see, okay, how do software updates affect my product, and how do I integrate the management system for this product life cycle. Then on top of that, I have the configuration and the documentation. So I need to know what my last configuration was of the vehicle in order to run test cases. I need to also know what software versions are my cars currently running in order to show and document, okay, I'm coming from this software version, I'm doing a software update, now I'm at this software version. Then related to vehicle type approvals and vehicle type approved systems, that then also means I need to know what configuration is there on the system, which is related to the documentation in the RxS win, for example. And then I also need to see, okay, I have thorough documentation of everything which I do in matters of software updates. And then last but not least, the type approval readiness. So having the certificate of compliance being then valid for 3 years, and then with this going into the vehicle type approval and seeing, okay, with the basis of the software update management system, this is how this is performed with the vehicle, and then the authority looking at the exemplary vehicle. And last but not least, the KPI and the reporting is a measurement and a tool for seeing and managing your processes and the management system. So seeing, okay, what KPIs do I have? What is reported? What goes well? What goes not so well? So that I can steer the management system appropriately. Because all of this should then be embedded in some kind of continuous improvement or a PDCA cycle, things like that, in order to really maintain and move forward and improve your software update management system. So these are the challenges for a general point of view from a management system and an organizational perspective, but there is, okay, of course, some requirements and some challenges that will have to be covered by the OEM, but also in the ecosystem by the supplier. So, and here we have some examples like the communication, coordination, and working together with suppliers, while you also need to address the culture and the processes, and also have the thorough documentation. And this would then also be for the supplier, so that they work great together with the OEM or the OEMs. They integrate their ISMS and the documentation, and they take care of everything. But then, of course, there's also a bit of specialities here. So the OEM needs to take care of the security, and also really needs to see, okay, how are my dependencies, what are my capacities in the vehicle, while the supplier might face then also identify targets and components, but on a wider scale also see, okay, do I have systems, do I have components which I might supply for different OEMs? So software updates may then affect the entirety here of the OEMs I'm providing for, or also to say, okay, what is it that a software update is causing for a component or a system, and how can I integrate these software updates then into different vehicles from maybe different OEMs. So here also more on the balance and the automotive ecosystem, some examples here for challenges. And then it's also important to talk about some standards, because you might already be familiar with standards, you might be using already standards, but you can also take some of these standards as a connection, as an interface, or also as a baseline for implementing and running the software update management system. So here are some examples. So the first example is, of course, FUSA, the functional safety. So as was discussed with the requirements, Safety needs to be always checked and is a concern also for software updates. So that's an important standard. Then there's the software lifecycle standard and the system lifecycle standard. So software updates might affect and interface here very well. So these are two standards that should be considered. Then we have the ISMS as a matter of the infrastructure. So first of all, having the documentation on the infrastructure on systems, which might be covered by controls with the ISMS, but also the security of the infrastructure that delivers software updates and where software updates are handled and managed on. And then if you might have this covered with security controls from the ISMS, you might have a much easier way of showing that the system and the documentation is secure. And so this would be a great interface between the SUMS and the ISMS in that matter. Then you have the configuration management. So you really need to know what is on the car, how and what am I testing against, how and what do I need to consider for compatibility, for interdependencies, and so on. So you really need to know how configurations of the vehicles look like. And then you also have to have a quality management, of course, which is the basics for requirements handling and so on. So this is an important topic as well. And last but not least, the cybersecurity management system, meaning, of course, that you have security involved, you have risk involved, you have vulnerability management involved. So all these and other factors are really playing a role here. So cybersecurity and software update management system are also working together in order to provide secure updates. So this is some examples. I'm sure there's more examples out there and other things that can be connected also on the procedural side, but these are some examples which we thought were important to mention here. And with this, let's recap a bit of the session. So we talked a bit about the regulation being mandatory and talked about the standard being the industry state-of-the-art reference document. Then we talked a bit about the different focus on suppliers for the CSMS versus the SUMS, but also how this might play out for the automotive ecosystem. Then we talked a bit about the timeline. So where's the ISO currently at and what is important on the timeline for the regulation. We talked about the SUMS and the CSMS common topics, risk management, vulnerability management, how these could interface, but also how governance and culture are really important topics. Then we had important keywords and talked a bit about some of the regulatory requirements which are important to know about. We talked about the software update processes more from a, let's say, software update process in general, and then also a bit about what you need to look at when you look more from an audit and a certification and a vehicle type approval perspective, and also look at some challenges here from the OEM and supplier and how to integrate everything into your organization. And last but not least, some standards which we thought were relevant and related to the software update management system. And so with this, I would quickly go into CYRES offerings. So with the software update management system, we also have cybersecurity as one of the major topics. And we therefore have the Academy, have also consulting offerings, and also have audits and assessments. So these are the pillars for the CYRES Consulting. And we also then for cybersecurity have a book and also the guide. So there's more information in general on these important topics. And we also have some learning have a learning platform with learning material online, which covers cybersecurity and also software update management system. And with this, I would like to thank you and wish you all a great time.